Thank you very much for this nice introduction. And also thank you very much for allowing me to give this presentation in English. I have to admit that my Italian is only useful in a restaurant to order food and wine, so thank you for this.
It's enough.
Indeed, I'd like to address the psychological consequences after infective endocarditis. And you all know that infective endocarditis is a low incidence, but a very severe and devastating problem. If you look at the epidemiology of infective endocarditis, we can see that in the general population, it occurs in 0.3 to 0.7 per 10,000 person years. So it's not a highly prevalent issue. However, if you look in people with heart diseases, children with heart diseases, the incidence of infective endocarditis is 10 times higher. It ranges from 3 to 6 per 10,000 person years. And in adults with congenital heart disease, it is even more, ranging from 7.5 to 10 per 10,000 person years. One could imagine, or one could expect, that endocarditis is most prevalent in the complex heart defects, but this is not the case. These are data from the Brompton, and they looked at all their patients with congenital heart disease who experienced an infective endocarditis. And they found that almost half of the patients had a mild heart defect. 23% had a moderately complex defect, and 32% had a complex heart defect. So this means that even people with mild congenital heart disease are very vulnerable for endocarditis. And indeed, you know better than anyone else that endocarditis is really a nasty condition. A lot of consequences in the heart, severe vegetations, compromised heart function. And also in terms of the mortality, 1 year mortality ranges up to almost 20%. So this is pretty high. But of course, for the presentation of today, I'd like to focus on the psychological consequences, because this is quite often an aspect that is forgotten, a neglected aspect. And you can imagine that on top of all the medical and the clinical consequences, the psychological consequences are severe. It was in 2017 that a review article was published, and these authors really indicated that the psychological consequences are a forgotten aspect in the care for people with infective endocarditis. And I'd like to address a few of the articles that were reviewed here in this review article. Why not all the articles? Well, these authors also have included a lot of quality of life studies where quality of life was measured and approached from a functional point of view, from a physical functional point of view. And this is really beyond the scope of the presentation. But what are studies that really are helpful in the matter of the current presentation? This is one study conducted in the Netherlands, published in 2009. And very striking to me, these authors has found that 11% of all patients presented with post-traumatic stress disorder. And if you know that PTSD is a long-lasting condition, this really means something. 1 in 10 patients do suffer from this long-lasting consequence. Another study published in 2010 showed that 55% of the patients showed depression and anxiety. And we are not talking only about symptoms of depression and anxiety. Here we are talking about the diagnosis of major depression and anxiety disorders. Once again, this is really detrimental. Most of the studies have been done by the group of Selina Berg and Trine Rasmussen in Copenhagen in Denmark. And these are two of their papers where they assessed consequences of endocarditis in a quantitative way. And without going into the details of these studies, they really confirmed that mental health in people with infective endocarditis is jeopardized. Most interestingly, also coming from these investigators, are the qualitative studies, because these really give a voice to the patients who went through an endocarditis. And the first qualitative study that was published from this group, entitled Patient's Perspective on Endocarditis, an Intermezzo in Life, it really means, and I will show this with the data from this study, patients need to put their life on hold for a while. They consider this time is a lost period in their life. What were the themes that came out of this qualitative study? The presage and appearance of endocarditis was a striking thing to the patients. Living through the endocarditis, so being hospitalized, going through the treatment and the consequences that this has. But also living with the endocarditis afterwards. It's not because the treatment has been successful that all problems are solved. They remain vulnerable for recurrent endocarditis and so on. The changes in body. Can I trust my body? It failed once, maybe it fails once again. How does my body looks like? Body image is very much altered in these patients. And finally, the long duration of the hospital admission for endocarditis, antibiotic treatment and operations if needed, makes that these patients are separated from their loved ones for a very long time. So having the loved ones at a distance was also very much an issue for people with endocarditis. After some years, this group did a new study where they looked at how do patients perceive the recovery after the endocarditis? What happens afterwards? And overall, 3 themes emerged in these qualitative studies. The first theme was an altered life. Their life is completely changed compared to the life that they had before. Significant parts or significant elements to explain this altered life is the unpredictable disease. What will happen? What are the consequences of this endocarditis on other conditions and on my life at large? I'm not the same person and my health is no longer the same, and what to expect from the future. The second theme was the shocking weakness. This is really an attack to someone's body. The extreme fatigue that patients experienced, the lingering illness, the emotional instability, and the visible traces of the disease are really putting a mark on the patient's life. And finally, the road to recovery. They need to rehabilitate, they need to recover from this trajectory. They need all support from clinicians, from healthcare workers, but also from their families. The professional follow-up is very much a key in this matter, and taking up personal responsibility for their own health, for the healthcare, and for adopting good health behaviors in order to minimize the risk for recurrence as much as possible. As I said, most of the work on psychological consequences in endocarditis has been done in Copenhagen, Denmark. No surprise that also this group translated this into a rehabilitation program for people with endocarditis. And also no surprise, given everything that I said to you so far, mental health was the primary outcome in these patients. Not necessarily exercise capacity and so on. It was mental health that they want to improve. The problem, of course, with doing research on infective endocarditis, due to the fact that it is a low incidence condition, are you able to recruit enough patients in a randomized controlled trial to have sufficient power? So let me come to the conclusions of this presentation. Research on psychological consequences after endocarditis is scarce, very much indeed. But the psychological impact is paramount. Post-traumatic stress disorder and mental distress are not uncommon, and these aspects do have a severe impact on the life of patients and families. Although we can imagine that the consequences on the long term are really there, we don't have data so far. So the long-term consequences are still a blind spot in our body of knowledge. And rehabilitation could play a beneficial role, but we need to wait for data from randomized controlled trials that can really show the beneficial effect of rehabilitation, including the psychological rehabilitation in these patients. Thank you very much. Grazie mille.